Seems like Star Trek Picard became a bit of a polarizing subject for Star Trek fans, or at least among a lot of the ones that I've interacted with. Ever since season one launched back in 2020, it seems like it's one of the things that you either love it or you hate it. So I'd like to take a minute and just share some of the reasons that I felt that Picard season one in particular was, from my subjective point of view, was some of the best Star Trek I've seen since the end of DS9. And then go into as well, discuss some reactions to some of the criticisms I've heard over the years and how they affect my appreciation for the show. And then while I felt that season two didn't quite live up to the richness of season one, it was still a lot of fun and something I really enjoyed. And then I actually haven't seen season three yet. So at some point, I'll be watching season three and sharing some of my immediate reactions to that. So in this first video here, I'd like to start just with some context from my personal history of interest in Star Trek, and then briefly describe how my reaction to Picard season one, the very late in the world of Trek and in my personal experience of Trek, and then describe how my reaction to Picard season one fits into the big picture for me. So for a little bit of personal context, I've been a Trek fan pretty much since I was old enough to talk. I grew up on scattered VHS tapes of The Next Generation, followed by endless reruns of Voyager because it was still on the air. And then as a teenager, I, with great excitement, watched through every episode of Classic Trek on DVD, all of Classic Trek except for Enterprise. And so the original series all the way through the end of Voyager. And I concluded at that point that DS9 was my all-time favorite because I found it to be the most compelling and engaging out of all the series. And I still pretty much, that would still be my perspective. Even though Voyager feels the most home for me, because that's the one that I watched most through like ages 11 through 13, let's say, or 11 through 14, whatever. When Trek 2009 came out, the one just called Star Trek, as though it owns the name. When it came out, especially before it was released and I saw the images and stuff, I loved the portrayal of the Enterprise. I loved all the classic old technology with a pleasant, bright style. But when I watched it, I found the characters in the storyline were so contrary to my expectations for Star Trek that I instantly became a passionate hater of the film. The way I saw it it's a shallow and immature bag of, let's say, a bag of greasy potato chips that belongs in a box with all other shallow action adventure films and doesn't deserve the label of Star Trek. Now, since then, I've chilled out a bit, and maybe if I were to watch it again, maybe I wouldn't feel as much animosity. But since my reaction was so intense back in 2009, I admit I have no intention of wading into those waters again, even 22 years later. And then at that point in my life, like many fans, I stepped away from my interest in Trek for 6 or 7 years as I put more focus on my undergraduate and then graduate studies. And then probably in early 2017, a friend recommended I give Star Trek Beyond a chance. I was pleasantly surprised that I shared my friend's positive reaction. I felt it was surprisingly Trekish, and it was a significant improvement over what I had seen back in 2009. I remember especially being excited to see the NX style ship that showed up partway through the film, because at that point I had watched through Enterprise and enjoyed it. Though since it was connected to the 2009 film, my mixed feelings about that kept me from being interested in really watching it again. Then I wouldn't see Into Darkness until something like 2021. And by the time I did, my expectations were so low that I wasn't offended by anything in it. I just thought of it as a kind of a corny fan film with an outrageous budget and not very funny for how much of a joke it was. When I heard rumors of a new official series in early 2017, which was probably before I watched Beyond, actually. But when I heard rumors of that, I was eager to see what new Trek might be, because like many fans, I felt this kind of excitement in the air at the possibility that Trek might move from being a beloved relic of the distant past that everybody's forgotten about except me, toward becoming something that exists in the current visible world around us. When I saw some of the early promo material, I loved the design of the uniforms, and I loved seeing the TOS style equipment. Now, of course, I did find the ship's exteriors to be kind of forgettable and uninteresting, but I think a lot of people did. And then when the show began, when Discovery began, I kind of made a mental effort to give it space to be whatever it was going to be. I didn't want to have high standards or strangle it to death by loving Star Trek so much that I strangle anything new to death in my head. And so when it started, my initial reaction with that, they had a two-part kind of a bonus pilot, so-called, and I thought it was awful. I was kind of yawning and rolling my eyes for much of it, because to me, it was just too overloaded with action and effects, while the character interactions were unconvincing and cheesy. But then when I got to the actual first episode, which was supposed to be the first episode, and then they created the bonus thing as a free bonus prequel. When I got to the actual first episode, it actually held my attention enough to keep watching and enjoy it. I thought, well, this I can enjoy without having any strong feelings for it or against it. Except for the strong feeling of the positive thing of, hey, it's Trek and it's current, which is kind of cool. Toward the end, as season 1 moved toward its end, I was fairly uninterested because of some of the plot changes that kind of lost my attention. But I definitely felt that when season 2 came around, it was just a distinct improvement. Season 3 was a mixed bag, with much of it being completely unrecognizable as Star Trek, and with other elements being even more compelling than what I had liked in season 2. Oh, it's ironic in retrospect that I've since then come to find out that some of the most compelling elements of season 3 of Discovery were actually kind of co-opted from earlier unpublished Trek content that was created in the silent years and never actualized. So that's kind of ironic. But then here's another ironic bit. Even though season 3 ended on an intriguing note that made me interested to see what's next, and kind of, I'm into this. But I've still not seen a single episode of season 4 of Discovery. So why is that? What kind of a weirdo would react like that? Well, even at its best, the only thing that really kept me coming back to Discovery, I mean, there was parts of it that I loved, but what really kept me coming back was that this is the new Star Trek. And for every eye-rolling bit that made me roll my eyes, for every yawn-worthy action sequence that was completely absent of depth of character or thematic significance, I just kept on giving it space because this was the new Star Trek and it wasn't that bad. I was determined not to be so committed to Trek that I mentally strangle it to death. I was determined to be more internally pleasant about it than I had been back in 2009 when I got so angry, with what was available. But then something else came into the picture that caused me to completely lose interest in Discovery. This was the new thing being released. And my expectations for this new series were kind of about the same. Much like with Discovery, I kind of lightly followed the news reports and I liked what I saw, but I didn't get too buried in updates. I didn't get too excited about it. I liked the idea Patrick Stewart would be coming, and I thought the little snapshots I saw of the other cast members in their costumes was nice. They're certainly not as compelling as the Discovery uniforms with their dazzling blue and their distinctly Starfleet but original look. And then season 1 began. Season 1 began, and suddenly it was like a dam broke inside me. All those episodes of Discovery where I had watched people flying through space while everything explodes for no reason, where I had watched corny fake Klingons that look more like Hirogen from Voyager or more like the reptilians from Enterprise than actual Klingons. And they talk like, is that Klingon? Or where I had watched engineers drilling holes into people's heads just for the heck of it. And suddenly this dam just broke for me, and I realized I had very little interest in wading through that kind of noise just to get the tiniest little tidbits of Trekishness that remained. What happened for me was Picard season 1 showed me what character-driven, compelling, psychologically rich Star Trek could look like in the very distinctive flavor that I remembered with such familiarity from Deep Space Nine. Maybe I just happened to be the intended audience. Because if you had asked me beforehand, if you had asked me what flavor of new Trek would I like to see, I would have said something in the mold of Deep Space Nine, because that's the best, so something in that mold where Starfleet people are around, but we're focusing on things that actually aren't Starfleet, such as a rundown Cardassian space station staffed with heavily traumatized Bajoran survivors. Or something like a little ship with a ragtag crew made out of disgraced ex-Starfleet captains and disgruntled ex-Starfleet officers, some of whom like to sit around reading existential philosophy, others of whom just wish they could study science without anybody getting in the way. To me, that's just the perfect setup for an original and engaging story. It's the DS9 flavor. that captured my attention so completely back when I was a teenager. But being a DS9 fan doesn't mean I didn't want to watch Patrick Stewart, because my DS9 fandom came after I was already a diehard TNG fan. And I always felt that Captain Picard's speeches were one of the best parts of TNG. For a long time, especially as a kid, Picard was my favorite Star Trek character just because Patrick Stewart's speeches are so compelling. Never mind that this new series has nothing like the TNG flavor. See, for someone like me, I didn't come to Star Trek Picard so I could watch a rehash of TNG. I came for something fresh and new. While DS9 was always my favorite Star Trek series ever since I was old enough to actually, evaluate it with a critical eye, my favorite Star Trek film was always First Contact, even though generally speaking, I don't think a lot of most Star Trek films, but I was so young when I first saw First Contact that I went to bed scared that the Borg tubules were going to pop out of the water bottle next to my bed and assimilate me, And even though First Contact certainly has more than its share of action adventure, the action has meaning, and it exists within a highly psychological context that is imbued with all kinds of interesting Trek canon concepts. So you don't get bored watching someone like me who doesn't, I don't thrive on meaningless action. But you're not going to get bored watching meaningless action in First Contact, because the action moves forward a compelling storyline that explores the psychology of the characters, the history of the Federation, and the expanding Trek canon about Borg, things like that. So once again, as far as Star Trek Picard goes, I guess I'm just the target audience. If you had asked me beforehand what I thought would mix well with the DS9 flavor, and you had suggested, well, what about a little bit of some themes from First Contact? Well, I would have said, that sounds amazing. And then maybe you would have asked, well, what else? What other ingredient is going to go into the magic porridge? Well, for me, my steadiest pre-teen Trek diet was Star Trek Voyager. And just about every Voyager fan that I've ever talked to or heard talking about it was sad when the series ended, because it ended abruptly with the crew getting home and the Borg getting this fatal blow. And then what? Where's the rest of the Voyager aftermath? All right, so what have we got then? We've got the DS9 flavor. We've got the DS9 style of storytelling. We got this familiar Star Trek icon who happens to also be the star of my favorite Trek movie, even though I don't normally appreciate Trek movies a whole lot. And then we also pick up Voyager a little, and in particular, that one theme that unites Voyager and First Contact, namely the Borg. The thing is, people like me weren't looking for a continuation of The Next Generation. We love the Trek expanded universe, and the idea of seeing Picard not on the Enterprise is part of the coolness. Not to mention the distinctly enriched and highly developed version of the character. It's this disgruntled old man who spent his sunset years on a vineyard growing into a compassionate and sensitive civilian who has long left behind his captainship over thousands of people, with all the emotional distance that goes with that role. This is Captain Picard meets Captain Sisko, the broken-hearted captain, meets Captain Archer with the kind of gentle father figure kind of guidance mindset. It really, to me, feels like Captain Picard meets Sisko, meets Archer in a realistic, very human kind of way. Because really, the Picard from season 1, this kind of Spock-like grumpy captain, has continued to follow a trajectory of humanization that began back in the mid-seasons of TNG, when he began to be more approachable, more of a likable leader. And that trajectory continued when, in Generations, he's crying over the death of his nephew, and we see his fantasy about fatherhood in the Nexus. And that same trajectory now culminates with this gentle old man hobbling around in season 1 Picard, who has long left behind the hard-nosed lifestyle of heavy leadership and life and death diplomatic bureaucracy. So that now, while his dissatisfaction and anger may be simmering forgotten in the back compartments of his mind, he has grown through experience in the quiet of his vineyard. He's grown through experience and living into somebody who knows what it means to love others from a deep reservoir of compassion and emotional sensitivity. So to me, it's so much richer than the grumpy tea drinker who we met in TNG season 1, not because that was a bad character idea, not because there's something wrong with that, but instead because this guy is somebody who doesn't have a cardboard cutout bone in his body. For that matter, this venerable old icon is somebody who I would admire, would like to be a little more like, even though he shouldn't have lost his cool when he blew up at the interviewer in episode 1. Of course, for that matter, what should one expect when a deeply compartmentalized emotional wound is suddenly mercilessly exposed to the cold, bitter air of an unwelcome stranger's aggression? But that said, so these are some of the reactions that caused me to fall in love with Star Trek Picard from the very first episode. It didn't cause me to suddenly hate Discovery or decide that Discovery wasn't Star Trek anymore. It's just that it gave me such a compelling story that so deeply enriched, rather than denigrating, this Trek universe that I love so much. So next video, I'd like to just focus in on the pilot episode of season 1, and from there I'm kind of wanting to progress through the series, and then once I get through, or if I start before I'm done with that, I also want to share some of my initial reactions to season 3 once I finally watch that and see what kind of exciting stuff's going on there.